when I left, it was the saddest day of my life. I mean, I cried my eyes out. It was like leaving a family. I remember kind of the farewell party at Recurrent, and it was like my greatest failure almost.
Hey there, Solar Warriors. I'm Nico Johnson, and this is Suncast. Each week, I pull back the veil on the life and business insights of clean tech entrepreneurs building the most noble and impactful companies of our time. I hope what you learn from this conversation is a catalyst for your own growth. So thanks for tuning in, and welcome to our tribe. Hey, happy Thursday, Solar Warriors. Welcome back to our long-form version of Suncast. I am super delighted to have you tune in yet again to explore the career and lessons learned from another clean energy founder and investor to inspire and inform your own journey and growth. If you're new to Suncast, thank you for joining us, and I encourage you to check out the previous episode with today's guest, Sheldon Kimber, where you can learn more about some of the fundamental elements of how he's building his utility-scale solar power company, Intersect Power. That was episode 229, and we should be linking to it here in the podcast app that you're using, but certainly over on My Suncast, you can get a link to that. If you just search 229, you'll find it. It wasn't that long ago. In that episode, Sheldon gave valuable insight into some of the nuanced topics that he faces as a solar developer. Things like how to define merchant and hedge, value of building merchant projects for solar, and what happens to the tail end of market contracts for these solar power projects. Well, many of you who really know me know that I was once in the music industry. And if you're a music buff like me, then you're no doubt familiar with the sophomore slump. The idea is that it's often very hard for an artist to have a massive hit with their debut album, then follow it with anything equally or more compelling in their second or sophomore album. But in statistics, it can better be explained as simply a regression to the mean. This happens beyond the recording studios and stages of music, of course, and it's a tale as old as Silicon Valley itself for serial entrepreneurs. Lest you think I'm being too critical, I'm no Fairweather Johnson about this topic. I've studied the effect both in the music and energy industries, and we've talked about it here in past episodes of Suncast. Some notable acts, however, have no doubt been able to overcome this invisible barrier and produce an impressive second act in their careers. Sheldon Kimber seems to share DNA with greats like Nirvana, Black Sabbath, and Led Zeppelin, coming out swinging with an impressive follow-up to what was arguably a blockbuster hit in their first appearance on the big stage. Well, after brief stints as a consultant at Accenture and then energy finance manager with Calpine, Sheldon did what most 20-somethings looking to transition into a senior role did in finance. He went back to get his MBA. In today's conversation, Sheldon and I dig into the fortuitous route from his MBA to joining the very much a startup, Recurrent Power, in the mid-2000s, and his ride to the top of the solar industry charts, helping make Recurrent one of the most respected and valuable solar businesses of the last decade. I really enjoyed hearing about Sheldon's journey, introspection, and decisions around how he'd re-enter the work world after having earned enough with Recurrent's exit to really never consider building another company or working that hard again. I also really appreciate his candor here, exploring the post-exit reality, the existential crises, and sense of purpose or lack thereof that often accompanies great success. Well, as some of you already know, and of course I foreshadowed, Sheldon's story is far from over. His sophomore startup, Intersect Power, is anything but sophomoric, and it's firing on all cylinders right now. What's driving it? Where does he go now? Stay tuned as we dig into today's entrepreneurial journey. Remember, you can always find resources and learn more about today's guest, recommendations, book links, and more than 250 other founders' stories and startup advice at mysuncast.com. For now, get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune in to another powerful conversation here on Suncast. All right, Warriors, if you are an avid listener of Suncast, then the voice on the other end of the line today is going to be no stranger to you, because you would have heard episode 229, where my esteemed friend and colleague Christian Rosalind interviewed Sheldon Kimber at the Podcast Lounge in Salt Lake City last year. I want to do a follow-up with Sheldon because I jealously didn't get a chance to have a one-to-one interaction with him. So today, I'm going to welcome and have a long discussion with Sheldon Kimber, the CEO and founder of Intersect Power. Sheldon, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nico. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, man. Good to have you back. And even though I think for most of the folks that came to the podcast lounge, they didn't really consider themselves having been on Suncast. It was a nice follow-up. But, you've had a remarkable career. I'll hit some of the highlights here real quick, and then we'll jump into how this all came about. For most who have followed your career, they know you as, one of the early guys into Recurrent. You went in, at a time where Recurrent was a very young company, and I'd love to hear more about that. But you started in the finance role and grew into ultimately being chief operating officer through 2014, and helped Recurrent grow into one of the most dominant and prominent developers of solar power in the United States. Before that, you spent time in power in a slightly different way. You worked at Calpine in investing in Goldman Sachs and Accenture, and you also attended UC Berkeley, where a number of listeners are alum. So the arc of your career is one that I find particularly intriguing, and not only that, but the what I would call the sophomore act. if you think about it from a music perspective, most folks that come out of the gun with with a big hit as their first act, as it were, if we consider that Recurrent, kind of flop on their sophomore act. And that's true for many of us. So I find it particularly intriguing that Intersect Power, which is kind of your follow-on to your time at Recurrent, is in fact doing remarkably well. But you weren't always specifically focused on clean energy. So I'd love in the outset here, if you'd give us a little insight into that spark of a moment where solar power or clean energy as a topic came into your worldview. When did you really decide that was how and where you're going to focus your career?
Like a lot of things, I'm not sure that it was any one moment, but certainly as the moments were happening, I'm not sure it was any one moment. I think, in retrospect, I came out of college having done my thesis, if you will, my undergrad thesis in regulatory economics, and written quite a bit on kind of regulatory economics in the fiber industry, in the fiber optics industry, as it was deregulating. And as part of that, wound up reading a lot about sort of, Ken Lay and his work on, deregulating the gas industry, the interstate transmission pipelines, those sorts of things. And so got really into sort of, the state of regulated industries and infrastructure, but moved to California really thinking I would be in tech. Then you get into consulting and you get moved around to different areas and kind of found a passion for valuation of power plants. At the time, there was a lot of merchant power being done. So I did a lot of work on power price forecasting, doing a lot of like dispatch modeling, financial modeling for the valuation of assets. At the time, it was sort of the days of Enron. So there was a lot of like fairly complicated commodity structuring, prepaid deals, structured credit deals, all that kind of stuff. And I found the complexity to be really interesting. So that was kind of when I really sort of fell in love with the power industry. So I've been at that, realistically all my professional life. And then my wife actually, while I was working on the gas-fired side at Calpine, my wife, after graduating in the late 90s, went to work for Dan Sugar at Powerlight. So, my wife is a really serious, as Dan would say, solar OG. She's got the real chops. Back when solar didn't really make you a lot of money, and it was a labor of love more than anything, and a passion, and she had that in spades. And so, I remember distinctly coming from the gas-powered industry, sitting at holiday parties at Powerlight, one of which was on a hornblower cruise, and I remember adamantly having a conversation with Sugar about, when is the solar industry going to stop selling systems and start selling megawatt hours? And this was I think this was 2001 or something like that. And And here we are. So that's not because I'm some sort of, genius or innovator. That's just because I, was already in the business of selling megawatt hours, and it seemed pretty obvious. So that was really my first interaction with solar, and I kind of knew from the start, getting into electric power, that I wanted to be part of, getting rid of, dirty power plants. I mean, believe it or not, even back in the early 2000s, Calpine was repowering America with clean natural gas, right? So when you looked at the carbon profile, if you will, and not just the carbon, but the NOx and SOx, right? Because acid rain and things were pretty big issues in the 90s, right? So when you looked at all of that, it really was a clean technology. I mean, obviously things have changed very, very quickly, but to some degree, I've always been interested in quote unquote clean power. It's just that definition has morphed quite a bit.
I didn't know the background in particular, and I love that story with Shug. I feel like if you have cut your teeth in California solar and you don't have a good Shug story, you got to keep working on that, because it's just waiting. It's waiting there for you. I'm really amazed to hear that your wife as well is a solar OG. I didn't know that either. So here we go, learning a whole lot more. One of the things that I continually say from the platform of Suncast, and in particular to anyone who will listen that is young in their career, is the incredible power of knowledge and macro understanding of working at a big company. And in particular, whether or not you're interested in power, if you're interested in consumer goods or marketing, go to Procter and Gamble and work your way around their programs, right? If you're interested in product at an industrial level, go to GE and go through their leadership training. You were at some early firms, like earlier in your career, firms like Accenture, that give you good formation. And I find it really intriguing that not only did you come out of college with this economic understanding of how the power markets work, but you landed at Calpine, which comes to the point that I always make is, if you really want to own and run a successful solar company, you've got to understand the power markets. And I find that of the thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of solar companies in the US right now, there's a small percentage that actually understand the power markets. The rest are, they're selling some eco-friendly solution that they believe is their contribution to and they're not wrong, but their contribution to sustainability. But just the idea of selling megawatt hours as a fundamental practice of how the power markets work is something that, in my view, is missing in the general training of those who would want to sort of help elevate solar and any other energy technology, clean or otherwise, as something that's going to scale and beat fossil fuels. My question was, Calpine on the radar for you? Was it a target, or how did you end up there and get really into the whole power trading and wrapping your head around the way these contracts work?
Yeah, I mean, Calpine at the time, you have to understand, was one of the darlings of the equity markets, right? I mean, Calpine, Enron, Dynegy, within energy, these were the fast-moving, innovative, companies, right? They were changing the world. They were, they were. There weren't renewables companies, right? And they were repowering America. They were, the build out of natural gas-fired generation through the late 90s and into the 2000s was one of the largest infrastructure build-outs probably in the history of this country, right? And yes, was it an overbuild? Absolutely, right? Just like everything, the capital markets, loosen up, and there's infrastructure tends to overshoot and undershoot and overshoot. That's what commodity markets are all about. But so yeah, Calpine was on the radar. I never intended to be a banker or a consultant, my entire career. I got in having, I really, really valued my experience in undergrad, which was a liberal arts education. So I have, degree in economics and, a lot of math from Kenyon College, which was an incredible experience. But, it doesn't necessarily give you, the heavy Excel and PowerPoint and, the internships at big businesses and things like that. And so coming out, doing strategy consulting, a lot of valuation, a lot of heavy Excel for a couple of years was just a great boot camp. So yeah, I firmly agree with you. you've got to do your time, right? I think a lot of people come out these days and they buy the vision of like, I'm the whatever Steve Jobs of solar, and I'm just going to go start a company and it's all gonna, all gonna flow from there. But I ground. I may be pretty young for having, done a lot of the things I've done, but at the same time, I spent a very long time grinding it out for other people at big companies, learning. And I think that's pretty pivotal and pretty critical.
I want to actually talk about the jump from Calpine to Recurrent. Recurrent, for those unfamiliar, was one of those companies that within the Bay Area had a certain level of like intrigue and mystique. When I was starting my solar company, I remember you guys winning the Sunset Water Reservoir. At the time, one of the largest projects in the U.S., 5 megawatts, 5 whole megawatts. I think the best part of it was that it was what was then considered a really amazing price per megawatt hour, north of 20. And we love to have those types of deals now. But how did you find yourself in Recurrent, working on the finance side of the business? And can you walk me through not only just sort of your introduction and finding yourself inside of that business, but growing to be the chief operating officer of the company?
Sure. So it actually starts out with like many good stories with sort of failure and frustration. Toward the end of the Calpine run, I got quite a bit of experience at Calpine, thrown into the fire doing deals at a very young age. In my mid-20s, I was doing some of my own deals and getting a ton of experience. And so I came out with a huge amount of interest or I think expertise for my age in structured finance and in commodities. And we'll always be thankful to Calpine for that. I left to go to business school because, frankly, Calpine was on the brink of bankruptcy and ultimately did go into bankruptcy 6 months after I left. So I went to business school at Berkeley, and then two things. One, when I went to business school, I was just going to do something completely different because this whole energy thing, particularly on the development side, was just too much stress, too much up and down, and I didn't want that. So maybe I was going to go work at Google or something. And then the strangest thing happened. I got there and I found a whole cohort of people that were really interested in energy and clean tech, and they kept saying, "Wow, you have this amazingly relevant background. Tell us more about how you project finance, and could it be done on a solar plant?" And so I kind of pivoted and said, okay, well, let me go and go back into energy. And then I went and did a summer with Goldman, thinking, okay, energy finance, structured finance, and Goldman is kind of it's the pinnacle of jobs. To be quite honest, it's at the time, certainly it was sort of the pinnacle of jobs you could get coming out of business school, right? It was one of the hardest jobs to get and lowest acceptance rates. It's the Google of finance. And so, went and did that. I got an offer from them. And then my wife said, "We're not moving to New York." and then she said, and then they offered me a job, more commodity structured stuff in Houston. And then we went to Houston and checked it out, and she said, "We're not moving to Houston." And so it was, so I basically turned down Goldman, didn't have a job, and got into the early spring of my final year, and most people had jobs, and and then this guy came in to speak. This was I think in January of 2007. This guy came in to speak at one of my lecture series classes about this company that they were starting, named Electric Roof, and that person was Arno Harris, who's was the CEO, yeah, and I just peppered him with all these questions about, do you understand how to finance this stuff? Are you going to, lease financing questions? And and afterward, he sort of said, "Hey, you want to go get a beer?" And we went out and chatted, and ultimately, I joined Recurrent as, with the first group of hires 2 weeks before we really took off as a real company. And then Arno and I kind of recapitalized the company when Electric Roof was ultimately turned into Recurrent, and that happened right around the time I joined. And then at first it was focused on being kind of a Sun Edison for REITs and institutional property holders. Arno and I really within the first year, saw the writing on the wall and began to pivot it to utility scale. And then when we got the Hudson Clean Energy investment, about a year in, he and I kind of took out the founders or some of because it had been founded kind of internal to a venture company. And so several of those founders weren't actually even working for the company. We bought those folks out and then we built the company from there.
When you say that you saw the writing on the wall around that structure of like the SunEdison for REITs, what was the writing that you saw?
Well, the writing was simply that C&I Solar sat in the middle of the range, right? So and Resi at the time too. It was too small to support the various diligence and legal and other structuring costs to use project financing, right? Project financing as a tool is typically done on very large infrastructure type projects, right? And so you would, anytime you did that form of financing, you would totally crush the economics of a project because you just weigh it down with too much cost. And so you just look at that model back then, and there was just too much friction, and now I think people still talk about the cost of customer acquisition and finance. And even now it's still pretty high relative to the margins that can be made on that scale of project. And so, I've thought for a long time that Resi and even small commercial, the point at which that will really take off, and I've said this in public in numerous occasions, is when it becomes cheap enough that the financing is almost like credit card finance, right? You just put it on your credit card. And, if you're a residential customer or if you're a C&I customer, you just pay for it out of your building CapEx, budget for the year. And, it's small enough that it has a great payback. And when it gets to that point, and it's getting very, very close, that's when it will take off. And all of these sort of like integrator, middleman, broker sort of, functions won't even be necessary in the market. So the writing on the wall was basically, we watched, the Next Lights of the world and the OptiSolars kind of racking up very, very large utility scale deals. We saw an opportunity in kind of the 20 megawatt range, and we just went in and, gobbled up a lot of those 20s and cobbled together several hundred megawatts of, 20 megs at a time. So we saw a niche where we could pivot to and ran at it very, very hard.
For those who are unfamiliar with the Wild West of 2008 in California, who were developing these projects that you guys came in and gobbled up? I presume, and you mentioned the Hudson Clean Energy investment, I presume you and Arno were structuring equity investments to have a treasure chest to go and buy projects from. But what was the project development world like at that time for solar?
So, we actually didn't buy much of anything. I've kind of prided myself from day one on two things. One, I think Recurrent identified very, very early that solar development was very different from gas and wind, just in terms of how you built a company. And two, that greenfield development, that buying projects usually just like, what's the adage? You make money when you buy, not when you sell, right? And so most of the projects that were for sale, and it's still true today, you pay someone way too much for having done way too little. and those are the projects you don't make that much money on. And so, when we set out to sort of pivot the company, the goal was to make it, was to build a process-oriented company with people who were a little less experienced, but focused it on being hyper analytical. We wound up staffing with a bunch of very inexperienced people, basically, while others were out sort of, grabbing the entire development team from an existing wind shop and turning them into, a solar shop, and doing deals almost like banks take down a whole debt team or a whole, bring people in, give them big contracts. And, it's kind of that rock star developer mentality, right? We didn't do any of that. I basically went out and hired Luke Dunnington and, Andre DeVilbiss and Seth Israel and, half these guys that work for me now still. And we built from scratch, and we built a team that was very process oriented. We were very analytical. We said, here are the 4 things you need. You need sites, permits, interconnection, and power marketing, right? And in every market you enter, you find which one of those things is in the shortest supply. You do that first, right? And so we had a whole bunch of kind of rules and process that we set down, and we taught people from the ground up that way. What it showed was that solar was very, very solar at utility scale even was very, very different from wind and gas, where in wind and gas, you have very, very site specific, like a gas plant has to be built where a certain transmission and a certain electric transmission and gas pipeline kind of meet, right? The further you go from that, the harder it is to build laterals and things like that. So there's some very specific sites where they make sense. Wind is the same sort of thing, right? The density of the resource is much more concentrated than solar. And so those are businesses where you really do need that like big lead developer who's done the big project before, and you put your head down and you just go straight through opposition, right? In solar, it's much more like venture capital. You spray out a bunch of options and then you kind of start to winnow, right? and there's a lot of different places that actually could work. And so, as you hit something that's an obstacle, you don't put your head down and kind of power through it. You actually are better off to just shut that one off and move on to the next one, right? And so it's a very different process we created. And I think that's what made us successful.
Sheldon, every time I have a chance to listen to you, and that includes the last episode that we did with Christian, I feel like I'm absorbing like a sponge, how the power markets work. I really appreciate how you outlined that concept that you sit down with this team, and as long as you have a system focus, you can teach them these 4 things: site, interconnect, permits, power marketing. These are the fundamentals. I imagine that comes from not only the years of work in the nat gas business with Calpine, but taking a look across the spectrum of what's happening. As you said, you guys pivoted from rooftop to utility and distilling it down to, where do projects run into roadblocks? Do you feel that while that was true for you back in 2008, does it continue to be true? It's kind of an evergreen truth about how the markets develop now, or have the fundamentals changed in 2020?
The fundamentals have changed quite a bit, and they actually changed during the course of Recurrent, right? At Recurrent, you could take an approach where you kind of chased after a bunch of smaller projects, which were big at the time, but were still not as big as, the next slide OptiSolar multi-hundred megawatts, right? So you could sort of spray a bunch of SGIP interconnection applications at the 20 megawatt level, 10 of them do incredibly well because the margins were high enough with the costs of the panels falling and the materials falling, and the ability to lock in long-term power contracts, a couple of years ahead of time. And so that business model is definitely broken down. And I could go into many, many, many ways how that has changed. I think though that probably the most pivotal ones are that really the scale of projects really matters more and more today, because as margins have come in, you essentially, in order to do well in the business, you essentially just have to do bigger projects, right? Because your margin per watt as a developer is much lower. So in order to make it worth your time, you need to go to larger scale in order to compete for contracts and offtakes at the competitive prices that are there, because it's become a much more crowded and competitive marketplace. In order to compete for offtake contracts, you also need to be at that scale. I'd say in addition to that, we learned some lessons at Recurrent, and one of those is just that scale breeds scale, which breeds, a lack of profitability, if you will. And so, if you have a big team, you wind up setting your strategic plan less about how many megawatts you think you can actually do in various markets based on market analysis, and more based on how do I make enough money per watt times the number of watts I'm going to put in the ground to pay for my overhead and make some profit, right? And that's kind of planning backwards, right? So you get into this spiral then of I've got a team that's grown too big, and because I'm growing maybe fast or something like that, and so I chase more and more 5 megawatt carports in upstate New York, right? And then that's really frustrating and takes a lot of time and work per watt. So I need to hire more people to do that well, but then I need to chase more 5 megawatt carports, right? And so it's a death spiral. What we've learned at Intersect, I think is really the lessons learned from the evolution of our careers from that, moments in 2007 to now. And that is, in the current market, if you want to make money and do well as a developer, the business strategy of Intersect is very, very simple. It's a small team. It's, very big projects and very few of them. And that's it. There's nothing more to it. And the reason I'm willing to sort of say that out loud, and, because people say, oh, well, that's not hard. We can copy that. But what's unsaid there is that in addition to being a small team, you also have to be an incredibly potent team that has a tremendous amount of experience, because it's really hard to put together a team of 20 people that actually have the experience and capability to bring 1.8 gigawatts to market in 2.5 years, right? And that's what our team has. So it's not a strategy that I think a lot of teams can pursue just from a talent and experience standpoint. But if you put together the right group of people, that's really the strategy that works in today's market.
Sheldon, I'm really grateful for just the detail of the conversation that you have been sharing with us. We mentioned, obviously, that you had this exit moment, this liquidity event that so many of us get into business, certainly those of us with MBAs, thinking about. You're among the fortunate few that have had what I would consider to be an early exit, early success. A lot of folks are probably listening to this thinking to themselves, oh, why in the world is this guy even working anymore? With 400 million, he must have made a pretty good chunk. Are you comfortable talking about it? And if so, I have a question around like what happened after Recurrent, between a Recurrent and Intersect. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, definitely.
You were an early employee. We don't need to get into like how much you made or whatnot, but I think it's important to kind of put a pin in for you when you were able to take a break and sort of pull the parachute from Recurrent. Was it like the classic fuck you money? Was it like never have to work again money? And if so, what did you go and do after that to kind of take the foot off the brake, or did you? Some people never do. I think I remember that you spent some time in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Would you give me a little bit of insight into how your life unfolded as a result of the Recurrent exit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I mean, I tell people all the time, I'm pretty open about it, that, we did very well. We made our investors an epic return on a very large amount of money, and in the process, we did very well as well. And I just like to put it as, I really don't need to be here. I do this because it's it interests me. I'm a total energy nerd and a workaholic. But what I can tell you is that, in leaving Recurrent, I think it's a little bit of a story of, certainly it'll come off as like, I hope it doesn't come off as like a sob story, because, nobody has a lot of sympathy for people who hit the lottery. Right. So, but at the same time, I just worked myself to death. I mean, I crawled away from Recurrent. It wasn't a victory lap. It was I crawled into a hole in the ground in Hawaii and, just tried to heal.
Can I ask a probing question there? Because I think we've all been through it, right? Like, I've got an MBA. I've been a part of more failures than successes. I've never hit the lottery, and yet I've had to do my own version of healing. What were you particularly seeking to heal from?
So in 2009, at the end of the year, going into early 2010, I was probably working, I don't know, 80, 90 hours a week. And I had been since late Calpine days, just total deal junkie, transaction junkie. That year, I think I flew, almost 200,000 air miles, almost with, I believe it was only maybe one international trip in there. So that's pretty brutal. And so, I'd been doing that for years. I mean, I turned the lights out at Recurrent almost every night. It catches up to you after a while. I wound up getting very ill with kind of like a viral illness, and then ultimately just never really recovered, and diagnosed with all sorts of stuff. No one really knows. From adrenal fatigue, chronic fatigue, all sorts of things. So, never really had a satisfying answer about what it was, but it left a pretty permanent mark on me. And I've been pretty open with this, certainly inside Recurrent. I didn't hide it, and I certainly haven't hidden it from the story of it from the Intersect Power crew. And so for me, it really was a real, it wasn't just, oh, I'm burnt out. It really was like I, couldn't get out of bed kind of thing. And I, I did the classic workaholic Sheldon Kimber thing and kind of put my head down and grit my teeth and like went straight through it. And I worked from, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, just hoping it would get better. And it never did. And so, yeah, yeah. So it was brutal. I mean, really, real issues sleeping and just a pretty hellacious experience all over. When I left, I honestly, it was the saddest day of my life. I mean, I cried my eyes out. It was like leaving a family. I remember kind of the farewell party at Recurrent, and it was like my greatest failure almost. I just kind of slinked away to hide somewhere and I really felt like my career was over, to be honest. I'd made this money, I'd made this success, but at the end of the day, like no one really remembers you. I mean, like the legacy of like a mid-sized business that put some solar in the ground is, you're no one's going to write about you anywhere, and kind of making your peace with all of that, accepting that might actually be the case, actually turned out to be kind of a good thing. Right? It stripped me. It stripped me bare of all of all the things that you hide behind that you kind of protect yourself with, right? Your ego, what people think about you, right? Oh, I'm important. People listen to me. Oh, I have a lot of money. I can do what I want. Oh, I have good ideas or better ideas than other people. It strips you of your conceit, and it strips you of, your to some degree all the things that you told yourself gave you worth, but it really didn't. And it forces you to try to discover the things that did give you worth. And some of those things for me are, obviously everybody has a family, and my family. I mean, at the time I was just having my kids were very, very young. And so there's obviously that, right? Everybody wants to reconnect with their family and have that relationship. But even in my work, it really forced me to say, what is it I want from work, right? And so moving to Hawaii, I took some time off and really worked on my health, and my health improved dramatically. And then as I got to the point where I wanted to start something new, I sort of sat back and said, okay, well, I have been sort of stripped down to like the essence of sort of what I want, what does fulfill me, and so I actually sat down with a woman who had been kind of an executive coach that I'd worked with at Recurrent, who knew me quite well, and she flew out to Hawaii. And before I started Intersect, I mean, most of the sort of core values of the company are actually written on a slide that I wrote with my coach in the context of a discussion that was, what does the company look like? What does the endeavor look like that makes it worth me coming back? And I mean, I can tell you, and I can tell you more there if you want. I mean, that what the things that I landed on are, they're actually pretty simple.
So I want to pull on the thread in two different areas. The first, and I'll come back to the core values because I think that's amazing. You mentioned that you worked on health. I'm wondering if there are any particular tools in your toolkit now that you were given during that time, be they some exercise or some other methodology that have helped you maintain a level of health now? Like, what were the acute ways that you worked on health, and how has that impacted the way that you think about health now and work balance?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, what you put in your body, right? I mean, so I've never been particularly self-disciplined about, what I eat and the activity I do. And what's interesting about kind of the physical issues I had was actually that the fatigue was such that I actually couldn't really work out heavily or train or things like that. And even to this day, I've actually been told not to push things, because we as human beings are given kind of a budget of energy, right? And you can look at that as, and you spend that in three key ways, right? Physically, mentally, and emotionally, right? And you're kidding yourself if you think that, the way that most people in, say, the Bay Area live their lives is sustainable. You will hit a wall. and so you really have to kind of balance, that whole budget. And so trying to dial back the work intensity a little bit, trying to, instead of running triathlons, try hiking, right? There's, it's this notion that everything you do has to be intense, right?
So
I think
intense, right?
that's the
Yep.
disease in our culture, right? That, like, if you're type A, you have to work 100 hours a week and you have to run the Boston Marathon, like, and maybe, and for some people that's great. Some people that may be exactly what's right for them and their body and their mind, but it certainly wasn't for me. So finding the balance of that energy that was right for me. Secondly, just, as you get older and, wiser, I mean, let's just say that, like, if you do want to perform at the very pinnacle of what it is you can do, right? If you do want to be, start your own company, be a CEO, do all this stuff, you kind of have to step back and look at it like being a professional athlete, right? You don't see a lot of professional athletes who say, "Oh, well, I'm just really good because I'm just talented." Right. And I'm going to eat whatever I want and have really kind of lackadaisical training. And that you look at someone like LeBron James or Tom Brady, and those guys, it's all work. It's all discipline. It's all self-sacrifice, And so I guess the realization I had there too, I guess, habit wise, was you kind of get what you put in. Right. And so you got to give your body real fuel. You've got to give your body real sleep. You've got, and so that kind of investment in being the best you can be. So those were the things I did generally.
I don't know if you've read Tim Grover's book Relentless, where he talks specifically about Kobe and Michael Jordan and LeBron James, all of whom have been coached by Tim Grover. Have you read that book?
I have not. That sounds interesting.
You would really enjoy that book, given what you just discussed. Tim Grover is in a class of his own. I mean, he has coached literally the greats of basketball, starting with Michael Jordan. Coached Jordan through his entire career as his strength and conditioning coach. And he tells lots of great stories about what you just said is exactly true. At the time of this recording, at least, I listened to that book last summer. And at the time of this recording, I haven't made any sort of public comments for sure on the podcast about the fact that I've gone through something very, very similar as you. Where, in fact, I thought it was adrenal fatigue and many other things. And this was the week following SPI last year, where we had like a huge successful event with the Podcast Lounge. And then I literally like couldn't get off the couch I remember it clear as day, on October 9th. I couldn't get off the couch. I was just completely done. And I have spent the last 6 months recovering from what appears to be something, if not Crohn's, something very similar to it. But I've been through all of the emotional roller coaster that you've been through. And what you're telling me, it does not sound foreign at all. It sounds like what many, many of our friends are enduring right now. The thing that I've found similar to you, I'll share a similar story actually around sleep. But this idea that real fuel, i.e. like you are what you eat, the food you put in your body matters, and real sleep are important. My doctor told me that I needed to sleep 10 hours a night. And I said, no, you're crazy. I've worn a fitness tracker since 2011. I know that I need 6 hours of sleep. She said, no, I don't think you're hearing me. Like, you can keep sleeping 6 hours and you'll keep feeling like you do. But if you want to heal, you're going to have to invest the time sleeping. And because that's when your body repairs itself. And I was in denial of that for, I don't know, a good month.
Yeah.
At least.
And what's funny is, denial is, like I've been told numerous times that, like, if I were to just stop, because even when I took the 18 months and sort of moderately, kind of clawed my way back, if I were to just stop altogether, I would probably make an even more complete recovery. But it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to listen. I'm not a very good listener.
I've been thinking about that a lot, actually, and I know we're going to talk about this a bit towards the later part here. We're already in the later part, but as we continue to progress in this interview, we're going to talk a little bit about your thoughts on kind of what we're going through now with the pandemic at the time of the recording, which is presently in April. We all know intuitively how to take care of our bodies. Even now, I practice the Wim Hof method, breathing, cold showers, the things that I know are good for me. I practice meditation. And I still find 3, 4, 5 days will go by without meditating. And I ask myself, gosh, in the middle of a pandemic, if I don't sit down and meditate, when do I kind of get it through my head that this is a cornerstone? You were given a gift, you were given an amazing opportunity to move your family to Hawaii and kind of unplug, as you said, for 18 months. That first generation American, that kid who saw the opportunity, the golden ring, and went for it. He wasn't sleeping in the background. He was waiting there for things to feel normal again. Every commercial solar opportunity counts. So why lose that sale to high demand charges? Did you know that you can offer up to 30% in demand charge savings at 1/10 of the cost of installing a battery? With DemandX, the innovative new demand charge reduction software from Extensible Energy, your client can boost ROI and reduce payback time without all the expense. And as a Suncast listener, you can get a free demand charge analysis by going to extensibleenergy.com/Suncast. And while you're there, check out 3 recent case studies on how this easy-to-install software is a win-win for you and your commercial solar clients. DemandX works for office buildings, retail, churches, and more. See for yourself at extensibleenergy.com/Suncast. Did you miss out on the live sessions of the Suncast Clean Energy Summit? We had so much fun with some of the most inspiring and impactful leaders in the clean economy throughout the Americas, learning about where the industry's going and giving you practical advice on how you too can participate and grow with us. Well, you're in luck because my team recorded the whole thing, and you can check it out over at suncastsummit.com. It's posted there for a limited time for free. You can also see all of the replays inside of our private Facebook group, the Clean Energy Guild, where all the videos are posted and lots of solar warriors just like you are connecting. Both are linked over at suncastsummit.com. See you on the inside. You mentioned that you brought in a business coach. I think that there's one thing that doesn't get shared enough, at least in the energy business that we're in, is the level of coaching that most executives engage in and require even. I'm not at all surprised that you had a coach, but I bet many people listening are. How did you engage with that coach, and how was she brought into your world? And then how do you feel that working with a coach has benefited you?
Arno was the person who really helped me bring a coach in back at Recurrent. I mean, I was 28 years old, kind of as the number 2 in that company, building and growing. And, as I mentioned, we went from, taking a round of funding to, a working capital adjusted $400 million exit. In a matter of just a couple of years. And we had, the 2 years before that, we had spent pivoting and rethinking, and, it was a rocket ride. And I like to tell people that the actual hardest part of being a younger entrepreneur and growing a company is not actually growing the company. Because in most cases, you're smart enough where you've got the skills, hopefully, and I can do the analysis, I can run the numbers, I can even manage. But it's more just the personal growth required. It's not actually the company growth. It's the personal growth required to keep up with it. And that's the place where a lot of people just fall down. You've got to be open to a fair amount of being self-critical, and you've actually got to want to change as rapidly as the company is changing. That came in maybe a couple years into Recurrent and has been a good part of who I've become. I don't do as much coaching anymore, although I do work with a coach regularly, but not as regularly as before, just because Intersect is a family. I mean, we've been together so long, most of these people and I, and my leadership style is just very open and authentic. And I haven't faced a lot of the challenges that scaling a large group of people. And I'm not sure I want to do a multi-hundred person business again. I don't actually find that piece of building a business that rewarding.
So when you sat down with this coach, you mentioned that you filled a deck with core values that to this day are the heart of Intersect. I want to understand two things. The first is, can you extrapolate on what those core values are? And the second, obviously 18 months and a lot of healing, you felt this magnet pulling you back into business. So after laying down these core values, why did Intersect need to exist?
To preview the second part of the question first, as I mentioned, like I don't need to be here, and beyond money, I don't have a desire or a need to build another solar power plant. I built a lot of those, and what brought me back was the desire to build something different, not just in the what, but in the how. And we'll get into the what in a second, because I do want to sort of transition back to kind of what makes Intersect different from a business strategy. But in terms of the how, that's really where trying to design an organization, and the core values there. My partner Luke, who was a co-founder with me on Intersect, he was the person I reached out to. He had run development for me when I was the COO at Recurrent. He had gone to Haas Business School as well, and I'd hired him right out of business school, and he had been with the company a long time. So he and I have a pretty deep bond that goes back a long time, and a real common sense of what we want to build. And so I reached out to him and shared some of this with him. We iterated on it, really kind of put together the culture of the company before we even put together the business plan of the company. So it's a bit odd, but I think effective. And so, the types of things that we really landed on were that our mission and vision are more along the lines of kind of a team of friends just working to preserve the planet, right? For future generations, for our kids, for each other. That's really who we are and what we're doing. I think the vision for the company is, when you go beyond mission to the kind of the vision, the how, it's really focused on being the most innovative and resource efficient and profitable developer that we can be, without necessarily being like, you'll notice that nowhere in that sentence is the word the biggest or the loudest or, anything like that. Right. And so I actually don't think there's enough businesses that step back and say, what's the most, that accept the challenge of building value with the, highest return on invested resources, be it capital or labor. Right. And actually, that's really the core of the sort of ethos of Intersect Power. We actually take tremendous pride in the fact that, in a 2.5-year period, we went from a GIS map and a greenfield, search, putting shovels in the ground on 1.8 gigawatts of projects, with a team that over the course of that period probably averaged 17 or 18 heads. You can do the math on what you think our overhead burn is, but I can tell you it's probably, on a cents per watt basis, our overhead burn is orders of magnitude lower, almost anybody else in our industry. And we take tremendous pride in that. I would, almost more pride than the scale of our megawatts or anything like that. That's part of the kind of vision for the company. But then, the values that go beyond that are really just about, people coming first. Some of the two things I've talked about already, which is just authenticity, being yourself and not feeling like you have to be someone else at work, humility, and then just enjoying the journey, right? Because we at Recurrent, we were always just waiting to hit the next milestone, right? Everybody was just driving and slaving for that next milestone. It got to a point where it almost felt like it was just a slog. And I look back on it, and I'm not sure I ever paused to really enjoy just the magnitude and the experience, because it was a tremendous experience. And I have a lot of nostalgia for it now, but at the time, I'm not sure I actually enjoyed it for what it was. So, really trying to focus in on having just a lot of fun. We have a company song.
No way, really?
We do like,
sing it for me.
We do little no. We do little like skit comedy things at our holiday party. And it's not me, I'm not organizing this. These are our people. This is the quality and caliber and just orientation of the people we employ really bears out the fact that I think they all share these values and kind of create an environment where it's not actually hard. We don't have like meetings to talk about our values, right? We're the kind of organization that looks back every now and then. Luke and I'll look at the values we wrote down in our deck, and we'll be like, wow, it's amazing how well we are doing. And then we'll put the deck down and we won't look at it again for a long time. We don't have meetings where we kind of remind people, here are our values. It's
That's
just
cool.
how we live.
You came back with Luke and you pulled together this world-class team that had performed well at Recurrent and who had similar ideals. And the goal, as you stated, was to accept the challenge of building real value with the highest return possible on the essentially the smallest team possible, to be efficient with resources and still deploy large-scale assets. In the interview that you did with Christian that we had on episode 229, you went into real detail about how you guys are fundamentally focused on what we colloquially refer to as the merchant market. You were insistent on saying market projects instead of merchant projects. You also used a lot of, let's say, nuanced vocabulary that folks probably stumble through. So I'd like to unpack a bit the core, some of the inner workings of Intersect, kind of how you view the markets. And I'd like to start with why in 2018 you thought, or used what you saw happening in the markets at the time, 2018, when you started pulling the Intersect team together, that led you to believe that the market price or merchant projects were going to be finally viable, and why, maybe even why they weren't viable prior.
Again, I mentioned that Arno, who's again one of my mentors, was much better than me at being succinct and clear with with communicating complex ideas. So I will try to channel my inner Arno and and be as succinct as possible. But firstly, I think there is this notion that merchant plants are simply plants without contracts, right? And that you just sort of take a flyer and you accept whatever the market price of power is, and one day solar will arrive at the point where it can just do that, and that will be great. I think what that fails to understand is it sees the world in a black and white context where you are either contracted or uncontracted. The business model that most people are talking about when they refer to merchant power or merchant power plants is the business model sort of pioneered by the Dyneges and the Calpines and the Enrons, not so much the Enrons because they actually sold all their assets and became more of a bank than anything. But that model was not about having no contracted cash flow. It was about having a whole lot of power that you needed to sell across an entire fleet of projects, managing risk, much like the seller of any other commodity, right? And so some of it you lock in for 5 years, some of it you might lock in for 20, right? And some of it you might just take the market price at the spot price, right? At the current spot price in the market. But you overall put together a portfolio across your risk exposure, if you will. If you've got to sell 1,000 megawatt hours, you might take a chunk and fully contract it. You might take a chunk and 10-year, 5-year. And so it's really just about a risk management approach to a portfolio. That's what the merchant power business model is about, right? And so that's what we have. We just need to understand that that's what people mean by merchant power, and is risk management with respect to how much you are exposed to the market price of power at any point in time. I think the insight that we had in our first portfolio is that shorter tenor contracts are actually potentially better on a risk-adjusted return basis than longer tenor contracts in the current market. And I'll dig into both of those things. So by longer tenor contracts, I mean, what people have been traditionally looking for, 20-year contracts with fixed prices from utilities. Those just aren't even available anymore. To the degree anything's out there, it's a 15-year contract. The prices on those have basically gotten so depressed that if you are offered the opportunity to contract your plant for 15 years at $20 a megawatt hour, or low 20s, but you can go and get $35 a megawatt hour to contract it for 5 years. You do the math on that, but almost almost as much revenue. Let's say 80% of the revenue you would have gotten in 15 years, you can earn in 5 to 7, right? And so why would you not prefer be sitting there in year 7 with, whatever, 75, 80% of the cash you would have had at year 15, another 8 years of exposure for sure, right? You're definitely riding the merchant curve at that point, but you have to have a very, 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 risk averse perspective to believe that in years, 8 through 15, you're going to not make that 25% back. And so that, to come out ahead of your 15-year contract. And so by signing those low price 15-year contracts, you're just essentially locking in your loss. And so this is the, I guess, insight. I mean, it's not an insight for anybody who's worked in gas-fired power or the traditional power industry. This is just business, right? And so, this is, I guess, sort of the first place where, when I say I didn't come back to Intersect to do the same thing again, this is like the most basic form of that innovation, if you will, right? Which is to try to bridge what the equity owners' expectations have been, which is, hey, I can get in and make a 7-8% unlevered on a 20-year deal, to try and bridge those expectations to help people understand, no, actually now that's probably like a 6.5, 7%, or a 6% unlevered, 7% levered, right, on a 15-year deal. And so to try to really bridge that expectation to, hey guys, solar is entering the real energy markets now, and you really do need to have a view that you're the owner of a portfolio of megawatt hours that you're going to actively manage the risk on over the life of the projects, right? And that's really what we tried to begin to do in that first portfolio. We still had some long-term contracts, but we began to push that edge and continue to.
Were there market forces at play that didn't exist in 2010? Or perhaps discuss the dynamics of banking for renewables projects in 2010 compared to 2020 that help SoftBank get comfortable with a 1.8 gigawatt portfolio that is inherently tied to more market risk than it would have been in 2010. Like, how did the asset owners, how have they changed the way they think about these things, and what fundamentally do we have access to by the way of data in the market that makes it a different argument?
Well, I think a couple of things on that. One, I mean, you have to understand that I'm not making the argument that project with a 7-year contract should have the same IRR expectation for an investor as one with a 15-year contract, right? So if you were to look at, if I've got a 15-year contract at $20, maybe the investor is buying it for 7.5 unlevered, and whatever, 8.5 levered. I'm probably selling my 7-year contracted plant for 9.5 unlevered and 11 levered, right? Or 11.5 levered or 12. So, what people have to understand is that the class of investor that's coming in may have to be just a fundamentally different class of investor, but it's not that they're not out there, right? There are plenty of people who in the low double digits, and they understand commodity risk and they understand power markets, and they've been investing in gas-fired assets and other assets for decades, and this is what they want. I think what's happening is, all those people who went out and raised whatever it is, pension money or other LP money, and told them, hey, I can go get you X billions of dollars worth of, 6 to 8% unlevered, high single digit levered, those folks are kind of out of luck if what they're looking to do is deploy that in utility scale solar, because that just ceases to exist. And so, when you look at someone like a SoftBank, I mean, it's not like they're not getting compensated for the incremental risks they're taking over what they might have bought in 2010. That said, I mean, just to be perfectly clear, the portfolio that they bought is not. It still has a fair amount of contracted revenue in it. We were, let's say, only beginning to test the bounds in that portfolio. I think now what we're looking to do next is really find partners long term who agree with us on that investment thesis, right? Who really see what we see about where the future of this solar asset ownership is going, because the opportunities are there now, and in 5, 10 years, this is just going to be like any other power market. And, you're going to be chasing after deals that have, weighted average, contracted revenue, whatever, 7, 8 year range and 12% IRRs, right? Those are going to be good deals. and there'll be a lot of people who want them. And so, you never made any money by following people. Like, only for a little small window of time there in the California RBS market did a group of people make money following folks who had already made a bunch of money in investing in solar. And I'm not sure how much that's going to be possible anymore.
As we see this migration, this transformation or change in the buyer profile, who are the types of buyers that will own solar plants in 3, 5, 10 years?
Well, I think you're already seeing a whole lot more sort of private equity players who for years have gotten comfortable taking the risk on, buying more mature gas-fired assets and things of that nature that might only have, short-term capacity contracts and maybe, the ability to hedge, 5 years or so of revenues. You've seen deals like that in PJM and in ERCOT, and those deals, they typically are structured such that they pay off pretty quickly, right? These people are not hanging out for 35 years waiting for their money back, and their return expectations for taking the risk are in fact, low double digits. You start getting into that kind of 11, 12, 13% range. And these PE shops are likely going to be some of the people that you see showing up. And you are seeing them already showing up. Other players, I think, are going to be folks that have, a lot more understanding of commodity risk. So, there are already a handful of players who play kind of financially, and they buy and sell power or gas or other commodities who may be willing and interested in stepping into actually owning some of those assets that can actually manage the risk and trade around the assets. So it's a whole, it's everything old is new again, right? I mean, good entrepreneurship, and good business in general is all just pattern recognition.
It's so interesting because I take for granted the things that we're talking about because my entire utility scale career was in Latin America. And it's interesting, right? Like I hear what you're saying and I'm thinking, oh, like, yeah, of course, we see large multinational utilities as well as hedge funds that are willing to take market risk, that are doing contracts for differences, that are willing to think about different types of swaps and spreads. And it requires having a complicated trading desk mentality that had been absent for a long time in the renewables markets, or certainly in the solar markets, maybe perhaps not so much in the wind markets. It's really interesting. And the reason I bring that up is because for those who maybe are unfamiliar and are thinking about how do I learn more about this, like just take a look at other international markets where competing head to head with conventional plants with effectively market pricing, as we've seen throughout Latin America, including in particular Chile and Mexico. There's a lot to learn outside of the U.S. market as well. Everyone today, including SIA, talks about the Solar Plus decade that we're now formally in 2020. Next 10 years, we're going to see Solar Plus. A lot of the people in the markets put that plus as storage, and storage has been that thing that we've all been looking towards from a cost curve perspective to say this is what's going to really unleash the power of renewables. You and Christian talked a bit about the value of storage. I'd like for you to unpack it for me in a way that maybe, again, channeling your inner Arno here, but you discussed the concept of a 1224 shape and turning that into a 716 block. I think that not only myself, but many others probably could get lost in that vernacular. Could you unpack the value of storage for us and how you see that providing leverage in the marketplace moving forward?
If you look at your average power market, right? When you look at a standard quote, it's usually for kind of a peak block, right? Maybe a 7x16. So 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And that's going to be, that's your standard traded product. It's a commodity. It's priced by everybody. Most of the time it's pretty liquid, right? So there's not a huge amount of spread between the bid and the ask necessarily. And so it's a huge amount of volume done on those standardized products, in California and Texas and in other places. The problem is that, every PPA that's been signed for kind of the utility PPAs in California and other places are just sort of what are called as generated, right? So whatever the generation profile of your asset, so solar puts out 8 hours a day, let's say, right? With a nice healthy peak in the middle of the day on sunny days. That profile is what is coming out of those plants, and the kind of RPS type contracts are just forced to buy that profile, right? Which made it really easy. There was no real risk to, being caused to either to the developer or to the owner of the power plant, because there was no mismatch between what was being purchased and what was being produced, right? It caused a heck of a lot of risk to the utilities, right? Because their load didn't look like the solar shape, right? And thus you get the duck curve, right? That's where the duck curve comes from. The utilities all have purchased these as generated contracts, and their load doesn't look like that. And so storage really provides the opportunity to solve the problem, if you will, that many of those as gen contracts created, right? And for lack of a better term, I'll borrow the sort of the what is now at the time of recording the phrase on everybody's lips. It flattens the curve. It can take you from being what is an 8-hour shape, right? And it can push the shoulders by storing. So you take that peak and you cut the top of it off and you move it into the shoulders. And so you take what was a very sort of like triangular 8-hour shape and you make it more of a rectangular, 10, 12, 14-hour shape. The more you can do that, the closer you make it to being a really highly liquid, right? Easily bought and sold, commoditized or, very standardized product. And the more you do that, the more valuable it becomes. So I'll give you the example that if you were to go and try and sell a solar shape, you might only get paid $25 a megawatt hour, right? Depending on what tenor you're selling, whether it's a 10-year, 8-year, 15-year. If you were to go try and sell for the exact same tenor from the exact same location, try and sell something that was more like a standard 7x16 block, you might get paid $35 a megawatt hour. And so the difference in value is enormous in most markets. And as more renewables penetrate the grid, it only gets bigger. And so, what you see is, people want new subsidies for storage, but what's really interesting is actually that the subsidy for storage is the subsidy for renewables. And I'm not arguing against subsidies for storage. I'm just trying to point out that there's a really interesting dynamic, which is all the subsidies for renewables that have caused this overbuild in many markets of renewables, they now act as an implicit subsidy for storage, right? Because the value of storage, the ability that it has to flatten that curve and take a less valuable shape and make it a more valuable shape, that is basically an arbitrage, right? And that arbitrage opportunity is created by the solar subsidies. The beneficiaries of that arbitrage opportunities are the developers, manufacturers of storage technologies, because they're the only technology that can capture that difference between the shapes.
I've never heard anybody put it quite so well, and I may say succinctly.
There you go. Arno would be proud.
I have a feeling that you're going to want to hit rewind a couple of times here and go listen to that again, Solar Warriors, because the complexity, there's more that you need to study and probably wrap your head around if you're just starting to look at solar and storage to even be able to, you may need to come back in a month or two and listen to Sheldon's interview again. But for those of us who've been in the market for a long time, the way that you just enunciated that makes perfect sense to me. And I've never quite heard it said that way. So I really appreciate and thank you for that particular angle on it. And, I love that last piece. The people who implicitly benefit from that arbitrage are the storage manufacturers, because nobody else can take advantage of the arbitrage.
I was going to say I should go back and listen to it because God, maybe that'll help me make the point more succinctly going forward. Just one more follow-on point on storage, and that is, I do think it is the decade of storage, and I do people ask what the power market looks like in the future, and I think as you get more and more viable sources of storage, the power market basically begins to look like some wind, a whole lot of solar, a ton of storage, and essentially a kind of firm or dispatchable renewable grid. But you're always going to have some amount of gas to set the price because there is no marginal cost. You will always need some remaining sliver of gas that will essentially set the price in hours where the firm renewables kind of don't clear the market. They don't have enough to meet the demand. So there'll always be some sort of backstop gas to the market. But that's the end game. People often ask me, what's the end game? What does this all look like? If firm renewables take over the market, how do you set a price, right? Because there's no marginal cost. And so, I think that's where we're headed. And I'm still a little unconvinced that lithium ion and current storage technologies are really where we're going to wind up. I'm still waiting for the much larger scale and more utility appropriate flow batteries. And you were asking what are the things that Intersect's looking at next, and what are we excited about? Why am I here? I'm extremely excited about hydrogen. I'm very, very excited about green hydrogen. And people think that I've rewound the tape back to the George W. Bush administration, and I'm going to build the hydrogen highway. That's not it at all. I have a real bee in my bonnet, if you will, for retrofit technologies and finding ways to bridge the clean energy gap as between. We seem to be able to decarbonize the electric sector, but how do we take that success and move it into other parts of the energy value chain? Because there's a whole bunch of carbon that we can't reach yet, and hydrogen is the bridge between the two. And you don't have to put it in cars. You can put it in heavy trucks and airplanes and ferries.
When you say green hydrogen, just so that I'm clear, you're referring to utilizing the electricity generated from renewable resources to catalyze hydrogen, basically to pull it from water.
Yes, primarily through large-scale electrolysis. The beauty of it is it becomes a drop-in replacement to a lot of other fuels at that point. You can do some sort of methanation. You can pump it directly into gas pipelines. You can mix it in with, natural gas, which is primarily methane. And, you can burn it in gas turbines, right? I mean, how many gas turbines on Earth are set up to burn hydrogen, and how many can be retrofitted to it? As a little bit of a side, I have a hobby horse of sorts about, I love electric vehicles. I own an electric vehicle, but when I really look at what can happen to deeply decarbonize the transportation industry, I'm not sure that electric vehicles can completely replace the current fleet fast enough to actually make a dent before we all ruin the earth. And I think that example plays out across a lot of sectors. And we really need to be finding these kind of bridges that allow us to. You can't just sit back and say, oh, we're going to replace all the world's infrastructure in the next 20 years and save the world. You got to find ways to find bridge fuels, if you will, or bridge strategies that allow you to utilize 100 years of, electric and industrial infrastructure that we currently use, in a cleaner way.
What habit or consistent practice, maybe it's a personal daily practice, or maybe it's something you institute in the company, has had the greatest impact on the way you work?
My habits are such that I don't really have any habits, which is a bad habit, right? I mean, I lack really any off button, for good or for bad. That's been good for me in a lot of ways, but bad for me in some pretty terrible ways. And so I lack a lot of self-discipline that is required to probably institute some good habits. Again, that's good and it's bad, right? I would like to say that will change, but you get to a certain part of your life and you just make your peace with the fact that you're trying to mitigate for the bad habits you have, right? And so I try to do some of the things to take care of my health and my life that I mentioned earlier. And otherwise, I've accepted that I have a lack of self-discipline and a certain streak of obsessiveness that really defines me. And it's a superpower, and it's the worst possible part of my personality all at once. And I'll just have to live with it.
I believe that readers are leaders, and I wonder if there are any books that you'd point to that have given you a particular shape to the way that you lead, or that you gift because they mean something to you, and what might that be? Probably
the best book that I recommend to everybody is my favorite book of all time. It's an author by the name of Ethan Kanan, who I'm not sure if he still does, but for a long time ran the Iowa Writers Workshop. Probably one of the best short story writers in modern times, in my view. And wrote a book named Carry Me Across the Water, which is just a short, it's a short novel. I would say it's the closest thing to sort of F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of great American novel, that I've read in modern writing. It's super tight. The prose is incredible. It's like he could, he picked every spare word out of it, and it's also just sort of staggeringly beautiful. The reason I would recommend it, I mean, like if I had to tie it back to, if I had to try and link it back to my leadership style, or it's just that it's a beautiful story about kind of like an older man reflecting back over the course of his life, and it's it's a pretty epic life. I mean, it involves World War II and a bunch of other stuff, but I think it's important to kind of live your life and ask yourself sort of what you want to look back on, right? When you're watching the rerun of the movie when you're older, what do you want it to look like? And and so it's a beautiful book. I would highly recommend it to anyone, though it has very little to do with most of what we've just talked about. My apologies for that.
No, that's completely all right. Yeah, I wonder, Sheldon, because I know that you do, you read a lot, not just books. How do you inform yourself most often to stay ahead of the curve? Where do you find yourself gathering information, and how do you learn best?
I mean, I think there it is really, it still is books, right? Because I mean, I think it's very, very tempting, and I'm the worst at it. Like I'm not judging anybody else, but it's very tempting to read the web, right? And we as a society are getting to a point where there's, you get the most superficial of information possible, right? A lot of times. And so even if it's a book that's not necessarily in the realm of what I'm thinking about professionally, things that feed your brain and get you to think, beyond yourself. For instance, I'll give the example, probably the book that has caused me to think as I did in college or as I did in grad school, which are these, periods in your life that are great gifts that most people don't realize at the time, right? Because they just allow you to think for a living. The book that has put me in that mindset most recently is Sapiens. That really spoke to me, and really just a eye-opening sort of, turn the world on its head sort of approach to thinking about human civilization through that lens. And, with that in mind, kind of been reading quite a bit about like artificial intelligence. I'm an avid Wired magazine reader, have been since like the late 90s. Sometimes great and sometimes not so great as a publication, but I still read it. But I guess I just try to put myself in that sort of like futurist mindset, if you will. I don't have much time for, considering myself a futurist or anything like that. I'm not sure it's necessarily a thing, but trying to think deeply about what the future state of things might be is productive, not because you're going to be right, but because it stimulates, the things that are going to drive you forward.
Well, Sheldon, as we have done for a couple of hours here, could go on, and I want to give you back the rest of your day, but not before I ask, how can folks who would like to reach out, learn more about you, find you, or follow you, where would they do that best?
Well, I tried my best to hide out from the world, but probably the best way to find me is feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I have a Twitter account, and tend to post mainly about my family and other things on my Twitter account. But Intersect Power has a Twitter handle. Intersect Power and myself do a lot of posting on LinkedIn around professional topics. There'll probably be a link to things like this and other talks and white papers and things on LinkedIn. And so those are the sort of cheap conduits for, what I'm doing, what we're doing, what we're thinking. If you reach out to me on LinkedIn and there's something more specific, it might take me a while to get back to you, but I can potentially give you an email and a better way to chat with me more directly.
And last, but certainly not least, let's end today, Sheldon, with a bold prediction. What one thing do you see happening in the market that maybe nobody else is tracking? What's in your crystal ball?
I would say that as solar becomes the cheapest form of energy on Earth, if it isn't already, on a per MMBTU basis equivalent, right? I mean, even cheaper probably than fracked gas, you will find yourself positions where most of that energy may or may not go on the grid. And so hydrogen is just the beginning of that, right? So I think you're probably going to start seeing things along the lines of, siting industrial facilities near cheap energy, near solar plants, right? You're going to see, again, conversion to forms of stored energy, be it, hydrogen or others. I just think that the thinking about solar strictly in the context of the electric power industry is going to change over the coming decades, because you simply are going to have too much very, very cheap energy for it not to find its way into other parts of, industrial and energy value chain.
Sheldon Kimber is CEO and founder of Intersect Power. We have been on a winding journey today with him, and so grateful to have him back here on Suncast. Sheldon, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Nico. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I am saturated. How about you? Was that phenomenal for you? It certainly inspires me. Thank you, Sheldon, for sharing your journey with us and for inspiring us and many others to reach for the stars. The energy transition is in full swing, and entrepreneurs like Sheldon help you and I see the possibilities and navigate the startup world with greater insight and courage. If you're not familiar with our Suncast Guild, our inner circle of entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, and apprentices on the path to mastery, then go check it out in the member area at mysuncast.com. We'll be giving that a refresh here in this month as well. For a limited time, you can still join at our legacy price, but that'll be changing come July. I'd love to hear from you. What topics and guests should we have on the show or on our LinkedIn Live events? Hey, speaking of live, be sure to be following me on LinkedIn so you don't miss our next trainings and webinars. And lastly, please do join our free Facebook group, The Energy Guild. You can network with hundreds of other clean energy professionals and get access to exclusive live trainings, mentorship, guild-only guides, and more. I hope you'll tune in next week to get the backstory of another recent Tactical Tuesday guest, SEPA's Director of EV Research, Erica Myers. And until then, remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up, Solar Warrior. It's half the battle.